The royal family forbade Princess Margaret from marrying a clean, solid, loving man, then let her marry the pervert who made her life miserable. And Elizabeth knew. That's not my opinion. That's the story the Crown tells across multiple seasons, and it's a story backed by documented history. The show gives us something the palace never would, a clear-eyed look at how the institution failed Margaret not once, but twice. First, by blocking the man she wanted, then by permitting the man who would destroy her. This isn't about whether Tony Armstrong-Jones was bad. You already know he was bad. The Crown spent multiple episodes showing you exactly how bad. What we're going to do is something different. We're going to prosecute Elizabeth specifically. Because she had information, she made choices. And those choices reveal an institutional hypocrisy so stark, it's almost absurd. Let's start with what Margaret gave up. Group Captain Peter Wooldridge Townsend arrived at Buckingham Palace in 1944. He was a Royal Air Force officer who'd shot down 11 enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain. Earned both the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross. The man was a genuine war hero, not the ceremonial kind, the kind who'd actually risked his life defending Britain while bombs fell on London. He came to serve as equerry to King George VI. Margaret was 14 years old. And no, there's nothing to suggest anything romantic happened while she was a child. This matters because the timeline matters. Townsend was an employee in her father's household. He was married. He had 2 sons. Whatever eventually developed between them didn't begin in 1944. Margaret later told friends she fell in love with Townsend during the 1947 royal tour of South Africa. She remembered riding horses together through that wonderful country in marvelous weather. She was 17. He was 32. 16 years between them. We'll come back to that age gap. It's going to be relevant. King George VI died on February 6, 1952. Within months, Townsend's marriage collapsed. His wife had begun an affair with another man. He filed for divorce in November 1952. The decree was granted on December 20th, 1952, with Townsend named as the innocent party, legally blameless. His wife had cheated on him. He was the wronged spouse. So here's what you had by the end of 1952. A decorated war hero. A man who served the royal family with distinction. A man whose marriage ended because his wife betrayed him, not the other way around. A man who loved the Queen's sister. A man the Queen's sister loved back. And the institution said no. The coronation changed everything. June 2nd, 1953, Westminster Abbey, the first coronation ever broadcast on television, watched by 20 million people in Britain alone. Elizabeth placed the St. Edward's crown on her head and became, in that moment, the supreme governor of the Church of England, a church that explicitly prohibited remarriage after divorce while the former spouse remained alive. Outside the Abbey, photographers caught something they weren't supposed to see. Margaret reached up and picked a piece of fluff from Townsend's uniform. Intimate, proprietary. The unconscious gesture of a woman comfortable touching a man she loved. Within hours, those photographs had gone global. Within days, every newspaper was reporting what the palace wanted kept private. The timing couldn't have been worse. Elizabeth had just been crowned head of a church that considered divorce a violation of sacred vows. The memory of the 1936 abdication crisis, Edward VIII giving up the throne to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson, remained fresh. The British establishment that had rallied to prevent one king from marrying a divorced woman now faced his niece doing exactly that. The palace response was delay. Margaret and Townsend were told to wait until she turned 25. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 required the sovereign's consent for any marriage involving a royal under that age. Once Margaret hit 25, she could petition Parliament directly. If Parliament didn't explicitly object within 12 months, the marriage could proceed. This appeared to offer hope. It was a trap. Townsend was transferred out of the royal household, first to Brussels as an heir attaché, then to other postings designed to keep him at a distance. The separation was framed as a cooling-off period. In reality, it was designed to run out the clock. Margaret's 25th birthday arrived on August 21st, 1955. She was now legally entitled to petition Parliament, but cabinet papers declassified decades later reveal the conditions Prime Minister Anthony Eden personally communicated. If Margaret married Townsend, she would renounce her succession rights, her income from the civil list, and potentially her royal status altogether. The institution had created an impossible choice. Have your war hero, lose everything else: your title, your income, your place in the family. The church that just crowned your sister will consider your marriage illegitimate. The establishment that nearly collapsed over your uncle's choice will view you as a repeat offender. On October 31st, 1955, Princess Margaret issued her statement. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. Mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. She was 25 years and 2 months old. She chose the institution over the man. And here's where the Crown does something brilliant. It doesn't let the story end there. It shows you what came next. It shows you the replacement. It shows you Tony. Anthony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones was born on March 7, 1930, just 5 months before Princess Margaret herself. His origins were upper class but fractured. His father Ronald was a Welsh barrister. His mother, Anne Messel, divorced Ronald when Tony was young, later remarrying the Earl of Ross. This gave Tony a peculiar position in British society, not quite aristocracy, but adjacent to it. Moving between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The divorce shaped him. In an era when divorce carried real stigma, Tony grew up shuffling between households, developing what biographers would later describe as a talent for compartmentalization. He could be charming or cruel depending on context, warm with those who served his purposes, cold with those who didn't. The ability to maintain separate lives, to be one person in one room and someone entirely different in another, started early. He'd contracted polio as a child, leaving one leg slightly shorter than the other. The Crown depicts this as formative, a boy who felt damaged, who compensated through ambition and charm, who harbored resentments about being seen as less than whole. Whether historically accurate in its psychological specifics, the show uses Tony's physical vulnerability to explain his later emotional cruelty. A man who'd been made to feel small would spend his life making others feel smaller. By the mid-1950s, Tony had established himself as a fashionable photographer in London. His studio in Pimlico attracted clients from theater, dance, high society. He photographed the beautiful people and slept with many of them. His romantic history before Margaret included the actress Jackie Chan. It included, more significantly, Camilla Fry, the wife of his close friend Jeremy Fry. Let me repeat that. He'd had an affair with his best friend's wife. The bohemian circles in which Tony moved didn't consider this particularly shocking. Artists, dancers, theater people, the boundaries that constrained respectable society didn't apply to the same degree. Sexual fluidity was acknowledged, if not discussed openly. Marriages were flexible arrangements. The narrow path, as Tommy Lascelles would put it, was not universally traveled. Tony fit perfectly into this world, a round peg in a round hole. The contrast with Peter Townsend couldn't have been more complete. Where Townsend was a war hero, Armstrong-Jones had avoided military service entirely. Where Townsend's personal life had been relatively conventional until his wife's affair, Armstrong-Jones's romantic history was the subject of extensive discussion in London circles. Where Townsend represented duty, honor, the solid virtues of service, Armstrong-Jones represented something else entirely, something the palace should have recognized as dangerous. And the timing of this new relationship tells its own story. Townsend remarried in December 1959 to a 19-year-old Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Jaman. He was 44. She was 19. 25 years between them. Margaret's engagement to Armstrong-Jones was announced on February 26, 1960, less than 3 months after her former love married someone young enough to be his daughter. The man she'd given up was moving on, and Margaret responded by accepting the proposal of a photographer she'd been seeing quietly for months. Rebound dynamics, at minimum. Wounded pride seeking vindication. A woman in her late 20s, watching the love she'd sacrificed for the institution choose a teenager, and deciding that she too could choose someone unsuitable, someone who would shock the establishment that had denied her happiness. But here's the question the Crown forces you to confront. Not whether Armstrong-Jones was suitable, whether the palace knew he was unsuitable and approved the marriage anyway. The answer is in the documented events surrounding the wedding planning. When the engagement was announced, Armstrong-Jones selected his close friend Jeremy Fry to serve as best man. The same Jeremy Fry whose wife Tony had slept with. Shortly before the May wedding, Fry was quietly removed from the best man role, replaced by Dr. Roger Gilliatt. The official explanation cited illness with jaundice. The actual reason was that palace vetting had uncovered a 1952 conviction. Jeremy Fry had been prosecuted for a homosexual offense at a time when homosexuality remained illegal in Britain. Stop and think about what this means. The palace conducted background investigations thorough enough to uncover an 8-year-old criminal conviction. The palace took action when disqualifying information emerged, removing Fry despite the public embarrassment and the questions it would raise. The palace had the capacity and the willingness to investigate. The palace cared enough about appearances to act when they discovered something damaging about the best man. So what did that same vetting process uncover about the groom himself? Armstrong-Jones's reputation in London's artistic and social circles, where his romantic involvements and proclivities were subjects of open discussion, was not whispered rumor. It was known. The people he worked with knew. The people he socialized with knew. The affair with Camilla Fry was known within their social set. His other relationships were documented by multiple contemporaries. The palace had the capacity to discover this information. The palace had demonstrated willingness to act on disqualifying information by removing Jeremy Fry. The palace chose to proceed with the wedding regardless. This is where the prosecution of Elizabeth begins in earnest. She was the sovereign. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 gave her authority over royal marriages. She had required Margaret to give up Townsend, or rather, she had permitted the institution to create conditions that made that relationship impossible. Now she was being asked to approve Margaret's marriage to Armstrong-Jones. She had information, or access to information, about who this man was, and she said yes. The Crown gives us one of its most memorable elements in dramatizing this institutional knowledge. Pip Torrens portrays Sir Alan "Tommy" Lascelles, historically the private secretary to both George VI and Elizabeth II, delivering coded assessments of Armstrong-Jones's character. The narrow path is not to his taste. Think about that line. Really think about it. A narrow path, not to his taste. The narrow path of conventional morality, of fidelity, of heterosexual monogamy. What alternative paths might Tony prefer? The line says everything while saying nothing explicit. It communicates through euphemism what could not be stated directly. Round peg in a round hole. A man who fits too perfectly into a particular social context. One the speaker declines to name directly. But everyone in that room knew exactly what kind of hole was being referenced. The bohemian world. The artistic circles. The spaces where the rules were different. Now, the real Tommy Lascelles retired in 1953, years before the Armstrong-Jones engagement. His presence in the crown represents institutional memory rather than literal involvement. But the euphemisms capture something true about how such matters would have been discussed in palace circles. Through indirection, implication, coded language that allowed the unspeakable to be communicated without ever being stated. Pip Torrens delivers these lines with wry precision, aristocratic distaste masked as neutral observation. The sense that he's saying exactly what the institution knows, while maintaining plausible deniability. His performance is one of the Crown's quiet triumphs, a man who serves the institution while clearly seeing its hypocrisies, communicating disapproval through understatement because direct speech would be unseemly. The euphemisms are comedy gold. They break up the prosecution with entertainment, but they're also evidence. They demonstrate through dramatic interpretation that the palace knew. Someone in those rooms understood who Tony was. Someone chose not to stop it. And Elizabeth? What did Elizabeth do with this information? In the Crown's telling, she let it proceed. Princess Margaret married Tony Armstrong-Jones at Westminster Abbey on May 6, 1960. The ceremony was the first royal wedding ever broadcast on television. An estimated 300 million viewers worldwide watched what was presented as a fairy tale conclusion to Margaret's years of romantic difficulty. The sad story of Peter Townsend had been replaced by a modern love match with a handsome photographer who represented a new, more accessible kind of royal consort. The coverage was breathless, glamorous. The beautiful princess and her artistic groom, breaking with stuffy tradition, ushering in a new era. Armstrong-Jones was created Earl of Snowdon in 1961, given a title that legitimized his position in the royal hierarchy. The marriage produced 2 children, David Viscount Linley, born November 3, 1961, and Lady Sarah Armstrong-Jones, born May 1, 1964. For a time, the public narrative held. The private reality was something else entirely. The Crown depicts the marriage's deterioration with unflinching specificity. The charm that had attracted Margaret curdled into something darker. Armstrong-Jones, Lord Snowdon now, had a talent for cruelty that expressed itself in small, calculated ways. The notes he would leave for Margaret, the cutting remarks designed to wound. The affairs conducted with decreasing discretion. His infidelities included a long-term relationship with Lucy Lindsay Hogg, a relationship that became increasingly open as the marriage collapsed. But it wasn't just the affairs. It was how he treated Margaret when they were together. The coldness, the contempt, the sense that he viewed her as a trophy he'd won and grown bored with. The show depicts specific moments of cruelty, Snowdon leaving notes around the house, messages designed to hurt, to remind Margaret of his displeasure. The psychological dynamic was one of control, a man who needed to feel superior, who compensated for his own insecurities by diminishing his wife. Margaret, for her part, was not passive. She conducted her own affairs. Roddy Llewellyn, a gardener 17 years her junior, became her most famous relationship outside the marriage. Photographs of them together in Mystique would eventually contribute to the divorce proceedings. But the original sin, the fundamental failure, was Tony's. He was who he was before the wedding. The palace knew, or could have known. Elizabeth approved it anyway. The marriage limped on for 18 years. 18 years of mutual destruction, public embarrassment, private cruelty. 2 children caught between parents who couldn't stand each other. A princess who had given up a war hero because divorce was unacceptable, now trapped in a marriage that was a divorce waiting to happen. In 1976, the first formal separation was announced. In 1978, Princess Margaret became the first senior royal to divorce since Henry VIII. Read that again. The church that had blocked her from marrying a divorced man watched her become a divorced woman. The institution that had considered Peter Townsend's divorce papers disqualifying had to process Margaret's own divorce decree. The hypocrisy had come full circle. So let's lay out the institutional logic with brutal clarity. Peter Townsend, divorced, innocent party in those proceedings. His wife committed adultery. He was the wronged spouse, not the wronger. A decorated war hero, a man of proven character and service. But the existence of divorce papers triggered Church of England objections, and the institution used those objections to create impossible conditions. Blocked. Tony Armstrong-Jones, not divorced, never married. This single documentary distinction, the absence of divorce papers, apparently outweighed everything else. His romantic history with multiple women, his affair with his best friend's wife, the associations that led to Jeremy Fry's removal after palace vetting, the reputation that preceded him in London society, the warnings encoded in Tommy Lascelles' euphemisms. Permitted. Divorce, bad. Everything else, acceptable. That's the hypocrisy the Crown exposes, not through accusation but through juxtaposition. Here's what they blocked. Here's what they permitted. The institution's stated values: the sanctity of marriage, the importance of fidelity, the moral authority of the Church, were applied selectively. Townsend had the wrong paperwork. Armstrong-Jones had the right paperwork. The content of their characters was apparently irrelevant. But here's the thing, and this complicates the narrative in ways that intellectual honesty requires acknowledging. Peter Townsend wasn't simple either. Margaret reportedly fell in love with him at 17. He was 32. 16 years between them. When he remarried in December 1959, his new wife, Marie-Luce Jamagnet, was 19 years old. Townsend was 44. 25 years between them. See the pattern? Margaret at 17, Marie-Luce at 19. Both young women in relationships with a significantly older man. This doesn't retroactively justify what the institution did to Margaret. It doesn't validate the years of delay, the impossible conditions, the forced renunciation. But it suggests the institution may have had concerns about Townsend beyond divorce, concerns that were never publicly articulated, even if the official objections focused exclusively on Church of England doctrine. The man who was blocked wasn't uncomplicated. The blocking wasn't entirely unreasonable. What was unreasonable was the double standard. Blocking Townsend for divorce while permitting Armstrong-Jones despite everything the palace knew or could have known. Creating conditions that made Margaret's first choice impossible, then rubber-stamping her second choice without apparently caring what he'd done or who he'd done it with. Citing moral authority in one case, ignoring it in the other. The institution didn't just fail Margaret once, it failed her twice. First, by taking away the option she wanted, then by giving her an option they should have known would hurt her. And Elizabeth was at the center of both decisions. As sovereign, she had the authority over royal marriages under the Act of 1772. As head of the Church of England, she was bound by, or could have invoked, religious objections. As Margaret's sister, she had the relationship and the knowledge to intervene. She occupied every position of power relevant to these decisions. She didn't save Margaret from Townsend. The institution did that, with her acquiescence. She didn't save Margaret from Armstrong-Jones. She could have. She chose not to. The Crown doesn't let Elizabeth off the hook. It shows the meetings, the conversations, the moments when intervention was possible. And it shows Elizabeth choosing, again and again, the path that served institutional convenience over her sister's well-being. The path that avoided scandal in the moment while guaranteeing worse scandal down the line. By 1960, the monarchy had decided that the appearance of propriety mattered more than actual propriety. A divorced war hero was unacceptable because the paperwork said divorced. A philandering photographer with a reputation known throughout London society was fine because the paperwork was clean. Form over substance. Image over reality. Margaret would spend the next 18 years paying for that decision. And then she'd become the divorced royal that the institution had claimed to be preventing. Which brings us to one final detail. A piece of dark irony that the Crown doesn't explicitly connect, but the timeline makes impossible to ignore. Princess Margaret's wedding was May 6, 1960. Prince Andrew was born February 19, 1960. Do the math. Elizabeth was pregnant with Andrew during the engagement planning, during the Jeremy Fry vetting that uncovered the 1952 conviction, during whatever conversations occurred about Armstrong-Jones's suitability, during the decision to let it proceed. Has anyone stopped to realize she was pregnant with Andrew while all of this was happening? The Queen was literally carrying her next royal problem while mismanaging this one, creating one disaster while permitting another. The ironies compound across decades. The son she was carrying would grow up to bring his own scandals to the institution, his own associations with unsuitable people, his own damage to the monarchy's reputation. But that's another prosecution for another day. The Crown gives us the receipts on Margaret, the documented timeline, the vetting that caught Jeremy Fry's conviction, but apparently didn't catch or didn't care about Tony's history. The euphemisms that acknowledged what the palace knew, the wedding that proceeded anyway, the marriage that destroyed Margaret, the divorce that proved the institution's hypocrisy. And it asks us to do what the institution never did, hold someone accountable. Elizabeth approved this marriage. Elizabeth had information or access to information, and she approved it anyway. Elizabeth chose institutional convenience over her sister's well-being. Elizabeth bears responsibility for what followed. Margaret deserved better. She deserved better than being blocked from her first choice by a church that would eventually watch her divorce anyway. She deserved better than being permitted her second choice, despite warnings the palace clearly received. She deserved a sister who would protect her rather than protect the institution. Instead, she got Elizabeth. The narrow path wasn't to Tony's taste. The palace knew. They let him marry Margaret anyway. That's not tragedy. That's complicity. Subscribe for more stories like this